Hello, and welcome to the Budapest Forum, Building Sustainable Democracies. My name is Edward Lucas. I'm a senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, which is a think tank in Washington, DC. And we are here today to talk about how to reboot the transatlantic relationship. We've got a terrific panel. I'm going to introduce them in a moment. But I think that the organisers can be complimented for their prescience in having a panel of this kind at this time, because there's no doubt that the transatlantic relationship has taken a really serious knock in recent weeks, and we urgently need, as Atlanticists on both sides of the pond, to talk about what went wrong, and more importantly, how to put it right. I apologize to my dog in the background. He's been taught to bark whenever he has the word Atlanticist, and it's too late to change that now. I'm going to introduce our panel very briefly, because I think you'll already be familiar with them. Congressman Brendan Boyle, it's great to have you with us, Congressman. Tom Tugendhat, from the British House of Commons. Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and Alina Polyakova, the President and CEO of the Centre for European Policy Analysis. We're going to have a quick-fire interactive informal discussion. It's going to go on for just over an hour in order to finish promptly for the next session, which is with Ben Rhodes. I think it's really important that we don't spend too much time admiring the problem, but we get into solutions. What do we need to do? What do our elected representatives need to do to put things right? But I'm going to start off with you, Tom, if I may, just to give us a picture from your end of how bad is the problem? We've had a lot of people saying, particularly in Beijing and Moscow, that's it, Atlanticism's over, Taiwan's next, after that Lithuania or Ukraine, and you're all going to be queuing for evacuation flights, and the evacuation flights will never come. So there's no doubt that our enemies are making hay over this very serious defeat that we've suffered. But I'd be very interested in hearing from you, how bad is it, first of all? And are there any elements of it that perhaps haven't been brought up? Now, I'm going to come after you to Congressman Boyle and ask him to respond. Then I'll go to our two think tank colleagues, and then we'll come back for a lot more discussion about how to put it right. But first of all, over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Edward. Look, this has been a very difficult few months for many of us, particularly those of us who served in Afghanistan, but even those who were simply associated with the operation because we were members of one of the countries that was a contributory force. So I think this is a serious moment, and I don't think we should whitewash it. Effectively, it's a defeat. It's a defeat because we chose to leave rather than because we were routed militarily. But it's still a defeat. Our aims are not secure, and we must now deal with people who we had previously defined as enemies in order to secure any objectives in the country. So by any stretch of the imagination, that ain't good. Now, the question is, how bad is it globally? And this is where I think, today, less than 18 hours after AUKUS has just been announced, the Australian, UK, US partnership, it's worth putting into context what we're actually seeing. Now, here I don't agree, and I don't think it's much of a secret to say it, I don't agree with the Biden administration's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, and I didn't agree with the Trump decision to sign the instrument of surrender in November, and I didn't agree with the Obama administration's decision to put a timeline on Afghanistan. But what the Biden administration at least has done is they've withdrawn in order to focus on the principal threat that they see, which is, of course, China. And they've done it in order to focus not just militarily, but also in technology and in partnerships and building up alliances. And AUKUS demonstrates that they're serious. So if you are Taiwan today, or the Philippines, or Indonesia, or indeed many other countries around the world, then I think that the evidence that the Americans are absolutely serious about the alliance insofar as it is approaches the defense of the free world against autocracy, and in this case, China, I think we can see a very serious United States. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges for some countries around the world who may feel that they're about to be ignored. I think it's certainly true that in the US perspective, the war on terror is over. I think that may change, but I'll be very interested to hear what Brendan has to say on that. But the reality is, I think that the US partnership, those of us who are allies of the United States, whether we're in London or in Taipei, I think should be reassured rather than worried.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that Tom. I think you're putting given what you have been going through personally in the last weeks and days of getting people out of Afghanistan who you've served with and others who've appealed to you for help, and also the psychological burden of those you haven't been able to help. I think you're in. I'd just like to compliment you for the very balanced way in which you're addressing this. I talked to many people involved in the Afghan debacle who've found it hard to get through this without raising their voices and getting really personally upset about it. And I know what you've been going through, but you've sketched out the outlines of what I hope will be a fascinating debate over the next hour or so. But I want to come back straight over to you, Congressman Boyle, to give us your impression from the United States about how much realization do you think there is in America's decision-making classes about the damage that's been done to trust and credibility? Because I think without understanding the nature of the damage, it'll be hard to put it right. So let me throw that one at you first, and then we'll get on to more specifics about how to sort things out later.
First, let me just pay tribute to the more than 800,000 American soldiers who served in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades, as well as the 150,000 British soldiers like Tom and others who served as well, and of course tens of thousands of soldiers from our allied countries as well. I know that the last month or so has been it's been difficult for all of us to watch the video coming from Afghanistan, but especially for those who served and who sacrificed in Afghanistan. So that's number one. Number two, I would say that I'm surprised by the level of surprise around the world at the Biden administration's decision. After all, it was well known, certainly in Washington, but throughout the campaign, just how committed Joe Biden was to ending our presence in Afghanistan, as has now been told in a number of memoirs, Bill Gates's, for example, and some others. As vice president exactly 10 years ago in 2011, Joe Biden argued pretty passionately, including getting into some, by all accounts, getting into some interesting back and forth with the generals at that time over just how committed he was to getting the U.S. out of Afghanistan. Ultimately, President Obama made a different decision. That's when he decided, I think, to put in the 30,000 soldiers, but they would only be there for 18 months. So the decision by this Biden administration was certainly no surprise. The only change to it, of course, was from May 1st to August. That said, though, I think everyone was, whether they should have been or not, everyone was caught off guard by just how quickly the government of Afghanistan and the Afghan army fell. That certainly was not part of the plan. I'll tell you a quick anecdote. On the weekend that everything really happened, that Saturday night, the president of Afghanistan talked to Secretary Blinken and said that he would stay in Kabul and fight to the death. The following morning, he fled. So obviously that certainly caught many of us by surprise. Now, how we move forward, because I know that from what you've mentioned, Edward, that you want to focus a lot of time on being constructive. I do think, though, that we're in a much better place in terms of the transatlantic relationship than where we were during the Trump years. I mean, at the very least, we have a president of the United States who doesn't openly mock various heads of government of European allies, many of whom happen to have been, I think, not by coincidence, the female leaders of those countries, then Prime Minister Theresa May, as well as Angela Merkel. So to have a president of the United States who is a committed transatlanticist, who believes in that relationship, who really restores what had been the bipartisan consensus in the U.S. from 1945 on.
The next session will be Rebooting Transatlantic Relations. This panel will be hosted online. All speakers will join us also online. The panel is organized in partnership with the Center for European Policy Analysis. Thank you.
I apologize for that ghostly intervention, Congressman Boyle. Do please carry on. We're listening to you.
Yeah, so I'll finish this up pretty briefly. That Joe Biden really restores what had been the bipartisan consensus and the bipartisan norm. Obviously, Donald Trump was an extreme outlier in so many ways, but especially when it came to this. So moving forward, obviously, this has done some damage. I think there is recognition here that there is some damage, but there's also optimism that that it will not be a long-term permanent sort of problem, simply because as we look at all of the other threats we're facing, such as China, for example, the reality is there's the need for us to remain united. And I think that will end up achieving a more of a unified stance on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, thanks very much, Congressman. I'm really tempted to go back to Tom and relitigate the Afghan decision a bit, because that would be a fascinating panel in its own right. But I'm going to put the brakes on sharply on that one and move on to, I think, what the is going to be our main thing about how to put things right. And I'm going to come to first to Alina and then to Andrea. And the question I want to put to you is based on what the Congressman was just saying, that we have an Atlanticist administration. And I want to pull that apart a bit, because it seems to me that President Biden made a very generous and heartfelt offer to the European allies shortly after he came into office with his speech at the Munich Security Conference. And it's my impression, I'd be interested to hear both of your thoughts on this, that the administration was really disappointed with the response it got, that the Europeans did not step up to the plate on helping the United States deal with the threat from China. And they were really unimpressed both with the personalities and with the policies that responded. And the result has been that the, whatever you call it, the pivot to Asia or the focus on China has intensified, and Europe has gone crashing down the list of priorities for this administration. I may be wrong on that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Alina, you go first.
Well, thank you, Edward, and thank you to the Budapest Forum. Just really delighted that SIPA can partner with the Budapest Forum for this discussion on the transatlantic relationship. I think it's incredibly important for the reasons you just mentioned, Edward, for us to keep up these kinds of ties and these kinds of conversations and the dialogue that ensues. To just follow up directly on your question, I mean, I think what's very interesting about the discussions happening in Europe right now, in Brussels, Berlin, and certainly in Paris, is that the Afghanistan withdrawal has really reignited this debate about European strategic autonomy and how can Europe actually craft its own foreign policy and its own defense policy. And I think we're seeing a shift in how that conversation is being viewed from Washington now. In the past, when the term strategic autonomy was used in Europe, I think that was very much seen as a decoupling. That NATO would no longer be the primary institutional platform for a common and collective defense, which of course the United States didn't want to see. And on the other hand, that Europe didn't actually have the commitment, the political will, or even the capabilities and resources to develop its defense capacities to be able to act as its own agent in the world. But I think now we're seeing a shift where the United States is actually still I think quite reticent about Europe's capabilities, but is very much looking to Brussels to shore up support for a more assertive Europe that can take care of its own backyard, take more responsibility for direct military threats, most certainly that concerns Russia and the situation in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe's periphery, and take a much more active role in deterrence, because it's very clear that part of the withdrawal from Afghanistan also has to do with the administration's desire to focus all efforts possible on China. And we're already seeing what that is going to mean in terms of alliance structures. I think mentioning the fact that we have this new defense technology cooperation deal now between the UK, the United States, and Australia is quite significant. But I think this is the debate that's being reignited because of the disappointment I think we've heard from Europe, and certainly from Eastern European countries, especially those that are not NATO member states, like Ukraine, like Georgia, for example, who really looked to the United States to provide that security umbrella and are now not so certain that the US will be a reliable security partner in the long term. And I think that is where we are today. And we're seeing, I think, a really interesting shift in tides in how the debate is unfolding in Europe and also how it's being perceived in the United States. I think the decoupling framework is actually fading away, and there's more desire by the United States to see the strategic autonomy conversation develop into something real.
Thanks very much, Alina. And I think I understand that some people may have missed the beginning of the panel. So I'm just going to remind people that we are joined by Congressman Brendan Boyle from the US House of Representatives, who kicked off by, who responded in his remarks to Tom Tugendhat from the British House of Commons. And you've just heard Dr. Alina Polyakova, who is the President and CEO of the Centre for European Policy Analysis. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who is the Senior Fellow and Director for the Transatlantic Security Forum at the Center for New American Security, also in Washington, D.C. So, Andrea, do you want to contradict or in any way riff on the remarks that have been made so far, particularly Alina's diagnosis and prescription for what we should be doing next?
I think I rarely contradict what Alina says. So I kind of fully endorse
very wise, very wise.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Alina got it right. You know, I don't think that Europe has come crashing down on the priority list, Edward, as you suggested. And rather, I think it remains kind of a solid pillar of American foreign policy. Although you had the great speech at the Munich Security Conference, we should be reminded that Biden's first foreign trip was to Europe with the G20 and then the EU summit and the NATO summit. And of course, the meeting with Russian President Putin. But I mean, that signals, I think, his very strong interest in shoring up the transatlantic relationship. As Congressman Boyle said, this is one of the most transatlantic presidents we've had in a very long time. And I think as the United States and the White House is looking at a world of complexities and increasing diversity of challenges, there is recognition that we need Europe to advance and to be able to execute on our foreign policy priorities. And you can see that with the launch of initiatives. Alina talked about some of the innovation funds, but we have the Trade and Technology Council. We have a US-EU dialogue on China. I mean, they are putting in place the scaffolding, I think, to try to revitalize and strengthen that relationship. And I agree wholeheartedly with Alina that this kind of notion of decoupling is, you know, in the rear view mirror, I think. And instead, we're talking much more about, you know, burden sharing and a new vision of European strategic autonomy that does welcome and embrace Europe's calls to be able to do more to provide for its own security and defense. Yesterday, you know, von der Leyen gave her speech yesterday, and defense was a big component of that. She's talking a lot about announcing the launch of the European Defense Summit that they'll hold next year when France holds the presidency. They're talking about an EU-NATO declaration. We should be reminded that NATO is undergoing its review of its strategic concept. So there is a tremendous amount of energy, I think, in the relationship. And I think, you know, of course, Afghanistan was hard. I do think we shouldn't sweep it under the rug and pretend that that didn't set back what President Biden, some of his early accomplishments in the transatlantic relationship. I do think it hurt, and maybe it unwound some of the progress there. But we should also try to use it as an opportunity, given that we have this energized, revitalized discussion taking place in Europe about their defense capabilities and wanting to do more. Washington should encourage that. And I hope that, you know, getting to what Congressman Boyle was saying, yes, it was a setback. Yes, Afghanistan was hard, but, you know, we have to remain optimistic in what can we change and do differently moving forward. And I think this area of coordinating Europe's efforts to do more for its own security and defense is a really good place to start.
Well, thanks so much, Andrea. And I think that there's several sort of baskets emerging that we should talk about. There's the military side, and I think you're absolutely right that Europe is now at least talking in a more focused way about its own defence, and that raises a whole basket of issues. There's the kind of technology side and what the two sort of big legs of the Western economy can do to compete with China and strengthen their own technology side. And we've got this famous sort of dictum that America innovates and Europe regulates, and I hope we can move on a bit from that. And then there's a sort of third area about democracy and democratic decay, and which is perhaps particularly topical given some of the worries we have about Hungary, which are also expressed about Poland and some other countries. So I think that should probably keep us going for most of the next hour. And I'm going to start off with you, Tom, on the military side. You're a former military officer. You're also from a country which is the linchpin of the military transatlantic relationship and is no longer part of the EU. So you must be watching the EU discussions on defence with particular interest, possibly a note of scepticism. Give us your thoughts in a few minutes about how we should regard these EU efforts and what advice we should be giving to our EU friends in all those efforts might be most effective.
Well, I'm delighted that EU countries are talking about defence more seriously, and one of the side benefits, perhaps, of the Trump administration, I'm sure Brendan will look slightly awry as I say this, but one of the side benefits is that he certainly sobered people up into realizing they actually have to take this seriously, and the US leadership may not always be quite as reliable. He's absolutely right. The Biden administration is quite different, and certainly wouldn't have given quite that slap in the face. But this talk of EU defence it's something that's come up very often in the past. Most recently, the French government has been talking about it. But the reality is, when you dig down, and you don't have to dig down very far, you rapidly discover that what we're talking about here is cooperation in defence around Europe, rather than the EU having actually any command relationship over French troops or German troops or whoever. So I think that what we really need to be doing is investing quite seriously, all of us, by the way, including the UK, into European NATO. I mean, there are many NATO members that are not EU states. The three rather obvious ones are us, Norway, and of course, Turkey. And so the cooperation around Europe of NATO is absolutely fundamental to its security. And I mean, of course, the EU can explore ideas, as Ursula von der Leyen has discussed, but for those of us who watched her career as Minister of Defence of Germany, we're not exactly holding our breath to see what comes out of it.
Thanks very much for that, Tom. It's also worth noting that two of the countries that are most important for frontline European military defence are Finland and Sweden, which are not members of NATO, although very close to them. So there's a kind of Rubik's Cube to unscramble there. And if I can give a little plug for SIPA, SIPA's just done an extremely thorough, I should say, and actually also very interesting report written by me and General Ben Hodges, retired, on the political and military security of northeastern Europe. So if you are having difficulty getting to sleep, please have a look at that on our website and your problems will be solved.
One point, Edward, which is one point that people don't always realise about the European Union, is that it already is in some ways a defence relationship. You only have to read, I think it's Article 47. Who is it? I can't remember. I'm going to have to remind myself, which basically says, unlike the Article 5 commitment in NATO, which could trigger a very strongly worded letter in response, the EU agreement is total defence of the entire European Union by every member of the European Union. So it already is a defence commitment in that sense. What it isn't is a command structure.
Yes, that's the solidarity clause, which is an extremely important part of, I think, the Lisbon Treaty. Congressman, let me go to you next. For years, Americans have been saying to the Europeans, spend more on defence. When the Europeans start trying to do something, the Americans often say, no, not like that. From your point of view, when you see the Europeans spending more, which is good, and doing more, which is probably good, what advice would you give them from an Atlanticist point of view?
Yeah, so I flat out, frankly, very much welcome more European nations, particularly NATO member states, spending more on their own defense. Obviously, if most Americans didn't know about the 2% commitment before Donald Trump, they are aware of it after him because he kept harping on it so much. And he may have done it in an obnoxious way, But it wasn't just President Trump who very much stressed that. President Obama did as well, albeit in a bit more diplomatic fashion. I very much support this. I'm a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We will be meeting, knock on wood, we will be meeting in person for the first time in 2 years next month in Portugal. And I agree with Tom that one of the very few benefits from my perspective of a Trump administration was that he did, frankly, awaken a number in Europe to say, hey, wait a minute. We might not always be able to rely on the umbrella of protection from the United States. We need to take our own defense responsibilities more seriously. If I could pivot for a second, though, to a different bucket that you were mentioning, Edward, and that is about what I call the democracy recession that we have been experiencing for at least several years now. I might, not to worry everyone, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but there's another country on your list that I think you should have added, and that's the United States. I am here in my office in the Capitol, where overnight the temporary fencing that was around the Capitol after January 6th was added back because of this expected protest that we are scheduled to suffer this weekend from those who believe in Trumpism and what many of us call the big lie about this past election. A number of states, including my own in Pennsylvania, probably the biggest battleground state in the nation, is undergoing this sham audit. This is a worrying trend that may have started with Trump, but I think will outlive him. So unfortunately, there are a number of democracies in the West, including the United States, that see their democracies weaker today than 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
I want to have a whole round of discussion on the decline of democracy, if it really is that. But just for now, I want to stick to the military side. And my worry about the European military stuff is that it is not filling gaps, that it duplicates stuff. That's one worry. I would love to see a deployable sort of European Foreign Legion sort of thing that might have been able to fly into Kabul airport with sort of souped up, some mixture of the French Foreign Legion and the Italian Carabinieri. And I think that could be doable. But in terms of attracting United States attention, it's not just carrying more water when it comes to the defense of Europe. It's also, what can you do elsewhere? What can you do in the South China Sea? Britain has an answer to that with our aircraft carrier, and the French and the Germans are also sending sort of perhaps token naval forces there. But Andrea, when you look at this, and if the Europeans are doing more, how much is that going to be do more in Europe? And how much is that going to be do more, shoulder the global burden of military security?
I think that's something that's still being debated. And I think it's a conversation that needs to take place within the transatlantic dialogue. There's different models. Are we going to divide and conquer, where we ask Europe to do more in Europe while the United States can kind of pivot and focus that time and resources and energy on the Indo-Pacific? Or is it more of a burden sharing model where it's together? I think my concern with the divide and conquer model is that it does lead to more decoupling across the Atlantic. But again, I think these are things that need to be taken and discussed together. I will say, one concern that I have, and I think Alina was getting with this when she was talking about our Eastern European allies, I do think that there is a risk that this administration is overly focused on China. When we look at Russia, it is a persistent power. It is not going anywhere. And if anything, it is growing more aggressive and assertive. And so I do think we need to be careful that we aren't disproportionately focusing time and attention on China. And we need to get that balance right. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. How do we recalibrate, in our national security strategy, in our national defense strategy, as NATO is undergoing its strategic concept? We need to make sure that there is an appropriate balance between all of the threats that the United States is facing, and that we aren't handicapping ourselves in an area like in Europe with Russia. It's important for all sorts of reasons, not only because as we face two highly capable adversaries, There is a chance, and I will say it's a low likelihood, but we could face a two-front war, or at some point where Russia or China use a conflict that one or the other has instigated to advance their own objectives. And I think we can't risk signaling to President Putin that Europe is the weak link that then would allow Xi Jinping to pursue his revisionist aims in the Indo-Pacific. So I think China is important. It is the pacing threat, and I understand that, but I think we need to calibrate that properly. And just one thing on your question about, like, as Europe is increasing its own capabilities, and we oftentimes, yes, the United States throws up barriers to their efforts to do that. I think one thing that would help from the European side is to understand what the strategic aims of those forces and those capabilities would be. I think that's what makes Washington nervous sometimes. And so I think Europe can do a better job. And I know Europeans are talking about this. How do we define our own European strategic interests? And as long as the United States and Europe are able to kind of coordinate and have open communication, I think that might reduce some of the anxiety among some in Washington about what a more capable Europe means.
I'm sure a lot of people listening to you, Andrea, will be wishing that you're in the administration. That's a message that Europeans would be very, 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 very glad to hear. Obviously, that communication would be immensely improved if we had some confirmation for some of the top ambassadorships and other jobs, which are vital to that. But that's a separate question. Alina, do you want to wrap us up on the military side, and then perhaps kick us off on the next thing, which I want to talk about, which is transatlantic technology policy?
Sure, Edward. That's I get to do transitions. That's always fun. Well, I think just to follow up on Andrea's point, I just returned from a couple of days in Ukraine, and I have to say the picture from the non-NATO, non-EU states that find themselves very much in the direct line of Russian aggression is just, to be frank, quite depressing in terms of the United States and the kinds of partnership. I think for Ukraine, perhaps other countries in that part of the world, the administration's decision, Nord Stream 2, whether you agree with it or not, was very much seen as a bit of a slap in the face. And then with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, questions about not just US reliability, but I think it goes much deeper than that, about the United States' ability to control a situation of chaos. It has always been an assumption in some ways from these countries that when the US puts its mind to something, political will is one thing. When the US says we will do X, that we will do it well. And I think the Russians were very happy to play up some of the more chaotic scenes from Afghanistan in their disinformation campaigns. But the truth is those scenes did actually happen. And so I think that it's, Ukraine, perhaps Georgia and other countries are looking over the Atlantic, not only feeling a little less insecure, but also wondering about US capabilities and US ability to project power across the world. And I think it's putting these countries that have lost lives, that are continuing to fight Russian troops on their own borders, increasingly in a difficult situation. And I think if we look across Europe, where we're likely going to see increasing contestation and conflict, so the great power competition, but also just likely ethnic regional competition, is in these areas where we have very mixed alliances, like the Black Sea region, where we have both NATO, non-NATO, EU, non-EU states, all competing for freedom navigation, and we have Russian aggression and increasingly Chinese incursions into that space as well. Obviously, Edward, when you have the Baltic Sea, where we have these mixed alliances, and the Balkans. So I think increasingly we're going to see these kinds of areas really becoming potential problems. And I think the administration will prefer to have a quote unquote reliable, predictable relationship with Russia, so we can focus more on China. But at the end of the day, I think when the Kremlin hears that, they hear business as usual. Proceed as you like, and we will try not to do too much about it. So I guess we'll see what happens in the next couple of years. But I think certainly the concern was very, very high, and the anxiety was quite high on the ground in Ukraine. So that being said, to transition us to the next area that you want to cover, Edward, and we want to talk about on this panel, Andrea already mentioned that we have the Trade and Technology Council meeting coming up here in a couple of weeks as well. And I think this is actually has the potential to be a bright light in transatlantic cooperation. For too long, we've seen Brussels go in one direction, Washington go in a slightly different direction when it comes to tech policy. And we've been long overdue to get us off those diverging rails and start to actually think about, how do we work together in our common interest of ensuring an open and interoperable internet? Because clearly we are in splinternet world already. The internet in China is very different, to say the least. The Russians and other authoritarian states are also trying to control data and information on their borders. Andrea has also written quite a bit about this rise of digital authoritarianism. What do I mean? And so we're long overdue to get some things done and to agree to values and principles around technology and tech policy. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the TTC gets at the end of the month and how that whole process moves forward. But I think this is very much a step in the right direction. And I'll pass it back over to you, Edward.
Thanks very much for framing the issues, Alina. And I'll come to you next, Tom, from your position as the chairing the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. Do you think that our government here in London, other governments have understood what we might call the sort of the geoeconomics of this, that this is not just about profit and loss and market share and who gets to own what, but there's a strategic dimension, particularly in high tech, but also in other areas of transatlantic trade and investment?
I think it's something that is becoming clearer, but it's still something I'm afraid that requires reminding. I'm thinking particularly of things like the Newport wafer fab decision, which required me and the Foreign Affairs Committee and various others to really weigh in pretty hard before we got it reviewed several times and eventually got the Prime Minister to instruct.
Just remind us, what is the Newport, for the people who are not familiar with it, what is the Newport?
Yes, of course. So the Newport wafer fab is a semiconductor plant based in Wales, hence the name. And it's the largest UK manufacturer of semiconductors. And though it's not the most technologically advanced in the world, it is still an important semiconductor firm for the UK. It was being bought by a Chinese firm, or rather by a Dutch firm entirely owned by a Chinese firm, so effectively with the Dutch cutout. And many of us objected to this on the grounds that it is quite clearly within Beijing's security strategy to domesticate and control semiconductor production around the world. Now, as I say, this isn't the game-changing piece of technology, but it is the largest UK manufacturer. And if we want to have a credible possibility of building any future technology, then we at least need to maintain what we've got. And so many of us felt that this was an unwise decision. And we pushed very hard, including I asked the Prime Minister eventually in public about it and managed to get it referred to the National Security Advisor and so on. But so the decision has been changed. But we do find quite a lot, despite the passage of the National Security and Investment Bill earlier this year, which gives the government all the powers they need to call in various different deals, a bit like the sort of CFIUS plans or indeed FIRB in Australia. Then you would have thought that we'd see more action, but we're beginning to get there.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's very tantalizing to remember the era of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which would have provided a sort of framework for transatlantic economic governance. It wasn't just about the lowering tariffs, but also creating a kind of structure which would have, together with the TPP, would have given the sort of broadly defined West hands on the controls of the world economy and all sorts of standard setting and norm making and rule making and so on. And I wonder, Congressman, when you look, do you think we missed an opportunity on this a few years ago? I know you're part of the blue collar foreign policy consensus, which says that foreign policy has got to be run in the interests of your constituents, which is quite right. But is there a tension between what we need to do and what we want to do?
With respect to tech, I would say that I'm not sure if this is exactly answering your question, Edward, but I have to say, I think when it comes to tech, the tensions between the US and the EU are quite real. Data privacy, the digital services tax, just to name a couple. So I welcome the formation of this TTC, although it's still a bit vague to me what exactly the TTC will end up being. The statement in June certainly included a number of lofty goals and things that I support. I think we would all support, but I am realistic about the challenges of actually reaching agreement in these areas. And I'll be happy to be wrong about this, but I would forecast the tensions when it comes to tech will remain in this relationship for some time to come. They are really difficult to work through.
Andrea, any thoughts?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the congressman hit the nail on the head. Is like so I'm just almost repeating what he said, but everyone I think was really happy to see the Trade and Technology Council announced at the summit, but everyone I think is very concerned about what it will deliver in practice. And so I think that is still yet to be seen. We understand there's the 10 working groups and there's all of these issues, but I think when the rubber hits the road, what will it actually produce? And again, here, I mean, there is, the focus is China, right? So, that is kind of like laced through everything. And it just makes it more critical to work through some of the tensions that the congressman laid out. I mean, so there needs to be these dual kind of priorities. One, we need to address the irritants in the relationship. One, we need to kind of figure out how to protect our own industries. And then I think we need to do the standard setting and the kind of competing and the innovation. So there's a lot of different things that this needs to accomplish. It's a comprehensive challenge. And so I think we're all a bit worried, I think, realistically about what it will be able to accomplish and what it will deliver.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt emotions are running very strongly. And Alina and I talk about this a lot. And Alina, do you want to jump in on this?
No, just very quickly. I mean, I think there's been a lot of high rhetoric, as Congressman Boyle said, during the president's charm offensive in Europe on this particular issue. But some news just came out this morning. There was a stakeholder meeting that took place in Brussels to discuss the agenda for the TTC, and it doesn't seem like data flows are part of the agenda, which is a huge problem. For those who may not be fully aware, right now there's basically a conflict between a legal set of legal decisions in Europe that concern data privacy and the GDPR application that has put under threat what is basically the whole of transatlantic digital trade. And it's a huge issue, the so-called privacy shield, and we haven't resolved it. And the idea was for the TTC, I think, to try to resolve that first and foremost, because that's a low-hanging fruit. And then we, of course, have Brussels just plowing through its own agenda, a Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act that increasingly looks quite discriminatory against US companies. Just the way that it's framed, who these legislative and many punitive measures will likely affect, it really is so-called US big tech. And the reality is that we need to have a set of uniform standards rather than seeing US tech companies as the enemy. There's no question that we have lots of issues about tech companies these days in the United States as well. But I think the Brussels agenda doesn't seem to be changing in that particular regard. It doesn't seem to include European companies or Chinese companies, which is a huge issue. And I hope that these are the kinds of hard-hitting issues. I think Congressman Boyle is probably alluding to some of these questions in his comments that we'll get to actually discuss in these conversations. But I think it's not a good sign that data flows will not be part of the TTC agenda for what this commission or whatever we want to call it will actually be able to accomplish in a concrete way.
Well, if there were any European tech giants, then there would be a question about how to regulate them. Well, I want to move on to what Mike saw the other side of the coin. We've been talking about legitimate business broadly so far, but the other thing that's really struck me on the transatlantic relationship recently is the amount of progress that the United States has made on countering kleptocracy and how far behind European countries, and particularly my own, Britain, is now lagging. It used to be that nobody did anything about this, or if the United States did stuff, it was going after Swiss banks in order to try and collect taxes. But we've seen a real revolution, I would say, in the past year or so in Congress with different legislation that was passed just in January this year, the Crook, Repel, there's the new anti-kleptocracy or anti-corruption caucus. So you really feel things are moving on this. And FinCEN doing staff new laws on buying property through shell companies. I gave evidence myself to Congress in May on this, and it was really impressive how much is happening in America. It was also really depressing how little I had to report about my own country. And I really get the impression that this is going to become a burden on transatlantic relations, because Americans will not tolerate seeing London being the kleptocracy capital of the world, where we launder dirty money from America's enemies into the West's enemies into the world economy. So I'd like to ask you first of all, Congressman, am I right in my perception that America is forging ahead and across the rest of the world? And then I'm going to ask Tom just how embarrassed he feels about this and what his committee is going to do about it. And I shall come to Alina and Andrea for some further thoughts. And then we'll finally move on to the next bit, which is democracy, protection, promotion, and erosion. Congressman.
Yeah, Edward, I agree with you. And I would just say anecdotally, the increase over the last several years in public awareness of this issue is really quite striking. Just log on to Netflix and take a look at the number of documentaries and pretty popular programs that have been made on this issue. I think the publication of the Panama Papers, I think the ProPublica articles that have come out about very high net worth individuals who figure out ways to evade taxes. Elizabeth Warren in particular really centered a lot of her campaign on this issue. Although the cracking down on kleptocracy actually has bipartisan support, where there's a domestic split then is on the issue of taxation of very, very high net worth individuals. That gets wrapped up in this specific issue over kleptocracy. There's a relationship there. So there's no question that this is something that will continue. It has overwhelming popular support here. And as I mentioned, is one of those relatively rare issues that is bipartisan. You're on mute, Edward.
Sorry. And where does that leave the allies? Am I right that there's increasing impatience with the other financial centers that aren't doing this?
It's interesting. I would say while that makes logical sense, that probably gets a little bit less. My perception that does get less attention here than just the fact that it's happening, and the U.S. needs to get stronger and is getting stronger in terms of its laws. But it would naturally follow that if we're doing our part and others aren't, there will be eventually a loss of patience for those who should be doing something and aren't.
Because I heard that the Brits were told that they would not be invited to the Global Anti-Kleptocracy Summit unless there was progress on beneficial ownership, which is this business of registering companies with phony or invisible owners. And this is one of the many things that is seriously wrong in the overlap between our legal system and our financial system. But Tom, you follow this very, very closely. Do you think our government has realized what a potential pickle it's in with its most important ally? And are you satisfied with what the government of which your governing party, which you're a member, is doing on this front?
Well, look, Edward, you asked me the question because you know the answer, which is you've seen that I published a report through the Foreign Affairs Committee about Russian dirty money going through our system. Moscow's Gold, published May, I think it was, 2018. You know that I was part of the, I think it was my first rebellion, which was on beneficial ownership of overseas territories and jurisdictions which come under British influence, if not British control. So, you know very well, Edward, this is something I've been working on for a long time.
I'm just giving you a chance to boast about it, Tom. Don't complain.
So, look, I'm very pleased that the US is doing this, but I've got to be honest, and I appreciate everything that Brendan said, and he won't be surprised to hear I was speaking to 2 Republican senators about this very question yesterday. Both of them absolutely committed to the same question as he was. But, we all recognize that this is something that, although we all talk a good game, and we're certainly better than many, we also know that for various reasons, the jurisdictions that we control in the United States and the UK have a really serious problem with dirty money and effectively laundered cash through various different financial arrangements. So there is a lot of work for us all to do here. And I have to say I'm delighted by what I hear from not just from Brendan today, but actually what I hear from Congress and the Senate, much more.
Thanks very much. I had a good joke. It used to be that kleptocrats were used to take their money to what were called sunny places for shady people, but now it's London, which is a soggy places for shady people. Although I have to say the sun is actually shining here today. Andrea, Alina, do either of you want to jump in? Why don't you go first, Andrea?
Sure, and I'll just note, I mean, it's not just Congress that is doing such a great job, but it really is coming from the White House and the Biden administration itself. So this has been a key focus for the Biden administration. It was a critical part of the interim national security guidance that they initiated. One of their earliest national security guidance papers highlighted anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy as one of their key priorities. They released they launched very early on in the administration a whole national security study memorandum, right? So they're tasking the intelligence and actually all of the interagencies to take a look at corruption and to elevate it as a national security priority. And I think that's such a welcome change. So, I spent 10 years in the US intelligence community, and corruption for a very long time was treated kind of as a nice to have and as a democracy and human rights issue. And, that's how we enhance governance in these countries. And now we're really shifting the mindset to treat anti-corruption as a national security priority. There is a recognition that our adversaries like Russia and China use corruption, they weaponize it, and they use it to expand influence beyond their borders. And so, I think it's a really dramatic mind shift that's taken place with the Biden administration. And I maybe there might be some frustration, but I do know when you look at the document, and I was actually just Googling it online when this came up, there is a critical part of the White House announcement that is about building international partnerships. So working through the G7 and the UN and all of these. So I think they're trying very hard to bring like-minded allies and partners along. And then the last thing I just want to say too is I think we all within the transatlantic relationship, obviously the resilience piece and closing loopholes and doing all of that is critical. But I hope I think we start thinking more about how we can go on the offense too, in terms of, are there ways to use sanctions to bust up these corrupt networks? Should we start more proactively going after corrupt individuals? So there is certainly the resilience piece, which is critical. We have to strengthen it home, but I think we can also do more to take it on the offensive as well.
There's one particular point which is very much on my mind as a sort of part-time journalist, which is these slaps, the use of strategic lawsuits to silence critics. And I would urge everybody who's watching this, please, without delay, to buy a copy of Putin's People by Catherine Belton. She's facing a probably £1 million or more lawsuit from the Russians, who basically want not just to humiliate her and her publishers and get changes made to the book. The real point of this lawsuit is to deter anybody else writing about these subjects of the corrupt overlap between bureaucrats, intelligence officers, business people, government officials, and organized crime. And she's traced the Putin regime to its roots and done it, I think, better than anyone outside the classified world has ever done. And she's been punished for it. And the aim is to deter other people as well. So I think that maintaining our ability to do investigative journalism, whether it's through in the media or in publishing or in the think tank world, is going to be absolutely vital to this fight. But sorry, that was just me ranting on.
Can I say one more thing too, really, before we go to Alina too? Also, look what's happening in Russia and the crackdown on the investigative journalists. They're all being shut down. Golos is gone, everything from election monitoring, but they have especially gone after the investigative journalists. Yeah. And it is going to get increasingly difficult for people to have a sense of what's happening and to do this work. And so for that reason, the United States and European allies and partners need to think very hard about how to sustain those organizations and protect the people who are doing that work.
Alina.
Yeah, I mean, this is just riffing a little bit what Andrea just said. It's different than what I was planning on saying in response to your questions and the conversation. But I think it's also very much on the shoulders of the United States and certainly the EU to not just do more to help protect investigative independent groups, but we've also seen this massive exodus over the last weeks of Russian political dissidents who've been forcefully pushed out of their countries, basically under threat of imprisonment or harassment, things of that nature. We've obviously seen Belarus have a huge exodus of democracy activists. Many of them are ending up in countries like Lithuania, which has done an incredible job for a country that small and really becoming a host to all of these democracy movements, including Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the leader of a Free Belarus. And, to be honest, these people need a lot of support. And right now that's falling to nonprofit organizations. And there's not enough resources there. And I think the EU really has to step in here. I think London should step in here. And I think the United States has to step in here and provide just basic support to these democracy groups and activists, where they're ending up in an EU state like Lithuania, or they're ending up in Ukraine or Georgia or elsewhere, because this is really the way to ensure that we can show a real commitment, put our money where our mouth is, basically, to democratic values and principles. And I think until we're also willing to do things like that without worrying about, well, this is going to provoke the Russians to do X, Y, Z, or this is going to provoke the Chinese to do A, B, C, if we're talking about Taiwan or Hong Kong, I think we need to lead with our values. And I think that is unfortunately being increasingly forgotten. And maybe that's a bit of an overstatement for now, but there is a real issue and a real point of debate about whether we should be thinking about interests when it comes to foreign policy and values as a secondary consideration, or if we need to be putting values first. And I very much think we have no choice but to put values first. But unfortunately, I think I'm hearing much more of an instrumental approach, and that's not going to serve us in the long term. And I think the one way to show that is by supporting these kinds of groups.
Well, thank you, Lynn. That's a beautiful springboard for the final segment of our discussion, which is about this erosion of democracy and the tension between the values-based approach and the interest-based approach. And that is getting sharper and sharper. I think we thought in the 90s it was going to go away, that the convergence towards sort of small L liberal democracy was absolutely irreversible and inevitable. And boy, were we wrong. And we see it all over the place. And we talk about the need for a Black Sea strategy, which is absolutely vital. We've got to do that. Well, how do we do that when we have a government in Turkey which has more journalists in prison than I think any per head of population than anywhere else in the world? Serious problem there. We want to protect Georgia. Georgia seems to be drifting away from the kind of democracy that it had since the Rose Revolution, and nobody seems to be able to do anything about it. You've just come back from Ukraine. There's serious questions in Ukraine about the way that country's going. And this conference is being hosted in Budapest, which is unrecognizable in terms of freedom of the media, in terms of political independence and political institutions, from the country that I covered in the 1990s and in the early years of this century. So there's no doubt, whether you look at Freedom House's measurements or Human Rights Watch or anywhere else, we're losing. We're losing all over the place. And some of the alliances that we need to make and uphold to deal with our enemies involve deals with people who are doing things that we really, really don't like. Congressman, how do we sort this out?
Oh, I have that answer in 30 seconds. Just like my last election debate. But seriously, I had a conversation with Ben Rhodes, and he and I both stumbled upon the same thing. He and I happened to be born in the same year, 1977, and we're both members of the last generation to grow up during the Cold War. And he made the same, came to the same conclusion separately that I did. I did not realize just how much I was influenced by that, and accepted implicitly the view that, of course, liberal democracy will win, the good guys win, we all live happily ever after. And the last decade or so has been a cold, hard slap, challenging my mindset and my worldview that I just carry without even thinking. Now, in terms of the more challenging question, how do we revitalize it? It needs to become a more proactive part, in my view, of U.S. foreign policy. Beginning in the Carter administration, there was, for the first time, really, a focus on human rights. That was then picked up not until several other decades. You then had the George W. Bush years, which were almost Wilsonian in the view of attempting to export democracy and actually by force. But really, frankly, I would say that the idea that we are focusing on internal measures in countries and to what extent they are strong democracies, that's been hit or miss. That has not been a major focus of US foreign policy, and it absolutely needs to be. Another assumption, by the way, that has completely been turned on its head from that same era, the late 80s, early 90s, was the viewpoint, and I'm especially thinking of China here, but the viewpoint that no two countries that had a McDonald's would ever go to war with one another. And that if you had a free market, you would automatically end up embracing liberal democracy and human rights. And China has proven that to be completely false. I mean, here we are 3 decades later, and if an American NBA player dares to voice, or actor, dares to voice support for Taiwan, suddenly he's silenced because China is able to use the market power of having 1.3 billion consumers to its advantage and is able to silence American citizens and some pretty powerful American companies. So even though you asked for solutions, I'm afraid I come up short in that respect, and probably do a better job of describing the enormous challenges we face around the world when it comes to strengthening democracy.
Edward, you're muted.
Sorry, you're absolutely right. We have to defend it at home too. And one of the things that is absolutely shocking to me is that this Chinese hegemonic discourse control of our publishing and media and academia and so on. But Tom Tugendhat, you've got to go in a moment. So give us your parting shots before you head off. I think you're probably going to go and vote or something tremendously democracy in action. But while you're still here, give us some thoughts on how we reverse the decline of democracy.
Well, I think, look, Brendan set out the challenge very well, but I think the key to the response is things like AUKUS. It's building up alliances, it's reinforcing each other, and it's reminding ourselves why it matters. You know, you've got to remember in the 1970s and 80s, Britain, the United States, and the free world basically fought for every single seat in the UN, on whichever council, whichever body. We made sure that we defended democracy and we defended free countries wherever they were. And I'm afraid since 1991, we kind of thought we'd won. Well, it turns out we haven't. And now we need to remind ourselves that actually we need to fight for every seat and every inch. And it's a reminder of the US Army Field Manual, which I know Brendan reads religiously every morning, which has as one of its opening lines, every day do one thing to improve your defensive position. And it's absolutely true, and we've got to do it. And the way we do it, though, is we partner with allies. We build up the support of countries like Lithuania and Latvia. We make sure that we stand strongly with them when they get bullied over deciding to open a representative office in Taiwan, for example. We make sure that trade flows work strongest and best within democratic countries tied to the rule of law. And we make sure that we reward as much as possible through commerce, through diplomacy, and through aid, those countries which are on the arc of freedom, and we can do it, you know. And it's a choice, and it's a choice that we've eased off on for 20, 30 years for rather obvious reasons. And we've got to remind ourselves that for the first time in, well, generations, it is not an indicator of wealth that you're heading towards democracy. Sadly, some countries are showing the reverse, and we've got to change that.
Thanks very much, Tom. I know you've got to go, so we'll bid you farewell. And I think it's true that you can be getting richer and less democratic, and perhaps in the case of Britain, poorer but more democratic. Who knows? We will see. But Alina, you've started this with your academic hat on as well. So give us your perspective on democratization and how we can protect it, and what the tensions are between doing deals with the government and promoting the values and principles we like in the political system.
Well, I think the truth is that for the vision of democracy as an end state was a really powerful framework that we function under since the end of the Cold War, that if we help transitioning countries put in democratic institutions, you know, prove we're going to get a culture of democracy. And that's just really not what we've seen emerge. And I think in particular in some countries in Central Eastern Europe, that has very much been the case, where we've seen a reversal in some ways. And many scholars have studied this. And some have used, democratic decay, democratic recession as a big argument going on about what is the right way to really describe what we see happening. But I think we can all agree that, democracy is on the back foot. And it's not happening just in Central Eastern Europe, it's very much a global issue. But I think it's important to remember that the countries of Central Eastern Europe were once the beacon of democratic transition. The openness, transparency, freedom, and liberty that we associate with democratic values and principles, these were the countries that were fast out of the gate. And I think now we very much realize that democracy is not an end state, that it's a fluid process. And what that means is that the next generation, young people across the world, young people living in these countries have to fight. And I have to be honest, I'm very concerned about this current generation's ability to not take what they have for granted and to actually understand that, if you just let things go on and you don't pay attention, and you're in your TikTok feed all day or whatever you might be doing, playing video games or whatever, there's plenty of very, very smart, very active, ambitious young people out there, but I'm concerned about the next generation really understanding what it takes. And we're losing that emotional connection to the Cold War. We're losing the emotional connection to 1989. Those of us who were alive during that time period, it feels very alive to me as somebody who grew up under the behind the Iron Curtain for part of my life. But to a 20-year-old who hasn't even experienced 9/11, think about how far away 1989 seems. And so to my mind, I think we have to engage more and more at the local level, which is why I think this forum here is so important. We can't paint the entire region with one brushstroke and see it as in some sort of democratic reversal. There is lots to hope for there, but I think it's going to take a lot of non-traditional alliances, non-traditional coalitions, much more engagement from activist groups with young people to get them to be motivated, to get them to really understand what's at stake. And that's part of the work that we're trying to do in our small way here in Washington at SEPA and as other organizations doing this. But I think at the end of the day, this is what it comes down to. How do you re-energize the vision?
Yep. Well, certainly, when I look at our young colleagues at SEPA, I don't see people whose brains have been addled by TikTok. They're mostly clever and better informed than I am, including about events that I actually witnessed but have now forgotten details of. Andrea, final word from you.
I think I see it slightly differently, that it's not really just that there's less public support for democracy and the idea of it, but I actually think that we need to recognize that democracy is breaking down in different ways than it has historically. And increasingly what you're seeing is that it is very much a top-down process. So you're seeing, these are democratically elected leaders who are coming to power and dismantling democracy slowly, gradually, and incrementally. Oftentimes, in societies where there is very strong and robust support for democracy. And I think it's incumbent on all of us. I guess I'm less sanguine or less satisfied in saying we just have to remind ourselves why it matters. And I actually think we need to take stock of the fact that there are very new threats to democracy. We have polarization. I've been doing a lot of work on personalization as leaders at the top are consolidating power in their own hands, accumulating more power relative to political parties. I've done a lot of work on the digital dictatorship, understanding how authoritarian regimes, but it's not just authoritarian regimes, it's often like the weakly institutionalized democracies that are adopting technologies in ways that I think are undermining and eroding. So I guess my point is it's probably not just enough to remind ourselves why democracy matters and recognize, I think we need to start doing the democracy support work differently. We have to understand that democracy is breaking down differently, and that is going to require different responses. We cannot rely on the toolkit of the democracy promotion and support we did in the aftermath of the Cold War. That was a different world. Yeah. It was a unilateral world, and I don't think it works anymore. And I think we're going to have to start getting really creative. And it's not obviously we need public support for democracy, and we do need to remind people, but that's not a ticket. And so we need to reconceptualize the way that we're doing this.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end our discussion. We face new threats, we need new tools to deal with them. And I hope that both at SEPA and in collaboration with all our partners, including in Budapest, we'll be able to continue to flesh these out and find answers, as well as just admiring the problem. But it's been a terrific discussion. If you've only just tuned in, we did have Tom Tugendhat from the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons still recently, and it's now my job, and Edward Lucas from SEPA, to say goodbye and thanks to my panelists, Congressman Brendan Boyle, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and Alina Polyakova. Thank you all very much indeed, and stay tuned.
Thank you.